Hello to all of my listeners. I would like to thank you for tuning into the second episode of this podcast. Our guest today will be fantasy football guru Matthew Shaffer. We have yet another action-packed episode with some very interesting things going on in the world of fantasy football. First, on this episode, we are going to talk about some of the brutal injuries that have hurt fantasy football players this year. The most notable player to be injured was David Johnson. Johnson was the first overall pick in many drafts this year and unfortunately found himself out after the first game of the year. David Johnson is still yet to return to the field, and his fantasy owners have struggled since. Now, we will get some input from our guest, Matthew Shaffer. Hello, Matt. How are you doing today?
Doing well, Billy. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being here. Just got a couple quick questions for you about fantasy football.
No problem.
So, when did you start playing fantasy football?
I started playing when I was probably about 10 years old. So I guess 11 years now.
Wow. Would you consider yourself to be a good player?
I think so, but it's really hard to judge year-to-year basis.
Yeah, I get that. What do you have to say about the David Johnson injury?
That kind of stinks because, he's the guy who goes high in drafts early every year now, and when he gets hurt week one, it kind of screws up any strategy he had going into the season, so it's a bummer.
Yeah, exactly. I feel that one on a personal level. I actually drafted him this year. What kind of strategies do you use while playing fantasy football?
It depends year to year. You have to change for your draft position or just like what the players available for you, so it's different every year, but I don't think I'd have one same strategy every year.
All right, thank you. Thanks a lot for coming on the show.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Once again, a huge thanks to Matt for coming on the show. Now, we have one of my favorite segments on this show called Who's Hot and Who's Not, where we talk about who's been doing well in fantasy football this year and who hasn't. This week, when we're talking about who's been hot, the first person that comes to mind is Ezekiel Elliott. Although there has been some controversy on regards to whether he would be able to play this week due to his domestic violence allegations, Elliott scored a whopping 40 points. You would be lucky to have your Elliott on your team, and he has continued to be an asset to many teams this year. Our Who's Not of the week goes to Willie Snead, who actually did not score 1 point at all. Snead has usually been a good addition to any team, but has failed to show up virtually at all this year. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned into this week's episode of Talking Fantasy Football with me, your host, Billy Crank. Make sure you tune into our next episode where we're going to be talking about some of the most reliable fantasy football players every single year. And we will have a very special guest, Vincent Welsh. Thank you for listening and be safe.